Hello, and welcome to another episode of Liberty is Peachy. I'm your host, Kenyatta, and in this episode, I'm joined by ACLU of Georgia Executive Director Andrea Young. We discuss being on the heels of Georgia's historic voter turnout in the general election, the contested election results, and what lies ahead for Georgia voters as we approach twin, equally historic Senate races in January. Enjoy. Well, Andrea, ACLU of Georgia's very own, thank you so much for joining me.
Great. So great to be here on this award, on this prominent podcast.
That's right. Thank you. And I feel like you are the ideal person to ask. Is this what it feels like to be living through history?
Yes, this is a little too much history.
Okay.
It's,
Good deal.
yeah.
Well, they're in perfect segue because there is lots and plenty to discuss.
Yes.
Um, coming off of a historic election and then going into another round in January. So I want to lead off, coming off of the general election, and here in Georgia, where we've done the democratic process, and we have accepted the results. But the reactions to the
Yeah.
historic election, as I say again, have been fascinating to me personally, I'll
Yeah.
say. And we're hearing conversations and discourse around leaders and organizers about what some of these reactions mean and how they kind of um, reflect um past eras where we've had to go through so many things to achieve the voter rights that we do have.
Yes.
And I'm curious, again, very thankful for the opportunity to ask you, where do you think some of these reactions that we are equating and calling like the Jim Crow 2.0, where
Mhm.
do you think some of those reactions and the energy behind this stems from?
Yeah. So the ACLU of Georgia was essentially founded in part to implement the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Hmm.
So we started in Georgia at a time when African Americans were denied the right to vote systematically and quite prominently.
Hmm.
And fought very, very hard over the years to make sure that African Americans had a fair opportunity to cast a ballot. And that's been work that's been very intense the past 4 years that I've been a part of the ACLU of Georgia. And so, we have to look at this in context, in context in the whole history of Georgia. um, Access to the ballot is something that was denied African Americans first during slavery, then during the many, many years of Jim Crow, when you know grandfather clauses and white primaries were used to deny the right to vote. When I was a baby, my dad was registering people to vote down in Thomasville, Georgia,
Hmm.
and prompted a Klan rally. Uh, there is if you go to the museum uh, in Alabama in Montgomery that's dedicated to the many lives who were lost due to lynching. One of the people lynched in Georgia was Maceo Snipes, who voted in an election in the 1940s and was lynched afterwards. So black voters always vote. We have long memories. We remember,
Yeah.
and black voters always vote in this context
Yeah.
where this context of intimidation and even racial terror that's connected with our exercising the right to vote.
Absolutely. And that just what you just said brings up a very interesting point because we do remember, and a lot of the times that fuels our intention to get to make it to the polls and to inspire our communities to make it to the polls because we remember those trauma points, like you said.
Mhm.
um and you did mention the voter rights work back in 1965 that the
Mhm.
ACLU does. So I kind of want you to speak to and celebrate coming off of the general election,
Yeah,
the efforts that the ACLU of Georgia
yeah,
has done to
yeah.
contribute to this historic election.
So, the ACLU of Georgia, along with, many other organizations, has worked very hard to make it possible for every African American voter who wants to vote to cast a ballot. We blocked, poll closures, people being stripped from the rolls. And then in the absentee ballot rejection rates, And then in this last cycle, we got very, very granular and involved in what happens at the very level of the polls. So
That's right.
how do we impact the things that make for long lines? How do we impact the things that make for mistakes when people do show up to vote, and that make for people's absentee ballots, being rejected. So we've worked very hard on voter education and on these very technical aspects of voting. And I think what we saw in this election that uh, the turnout was overwhelming, nearly
Hmm.
5 million, and maybe more than maybe it is 5 million now. The count continues, and
That's
the
right.
counting of provisional ballots. I think the Secretary of State said, there are about 5 million people voted in this election, which is a tremendous increase over even 2 years ago. And so people voted in this election.
Right.
Um, and African Americans, also voted in proportion to their presence in this community. I mean, African American voters are over 30% of the voters in the state of Georgia. And despite that high levels of representation, we haven't had the candidate preferred by the African American community actually win a statewide election since the 90s. So it's tremendously, and that's one of the things that depresses turnout. If the people you vote for never win,
Exactly.
um, then it discourages you from making the tremendous effort to
Mhm.
come out and vote. So, African American voters made a tremendous effort. Let's remember, it is still COVID. People are tremendously impacted both by the health consequences and also by the economic consequences. So people cared about this election. They made the effort. They came out and vote. People voted in overwhelming numbers, all walks of life. And the result is the result. We said count the votes, count every vote. And the result is what we have. And the result is what needs to be accepted by people who believe in democracy.
That's right. And the point that you just made about getting involved on a granular level, that really just gave me an added level of appreciation for the work that we cohesively did as a team. Because what we were able to do with that, getting into the nitty gritty of the details of the polling and election process, we were able to fill the needs
Yeah.
of those different roles and duties
Yeah.
by promoting out to our community. So absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what was great is that you saw this outpouring of civic engagement. That that um, the that running elections is not something for other people; it's everybody's responsibility. And so we
Absolutely.
publicly advertised, in the public airwaves, on radio,
Mhm.
for people to volunteer and come out to work for the Board of Elections, to help so that they would have enough staff
Yeah.
for the people who showed up to vote.
And it was really cool seeing
Mhm.
um, people who hadn't been involved at that level before get involved with the community,
Mhm.
and to see that level of civic engagement. And I wanted
Yeah.
to ask you, in terms of that, ahead of these two pivotal Senate races, what say you about the importance of voting and actively fueling our democracy through civic engagement as
Yes.
we go into January?
Yeah, no, I think, everyone who volunteered to be a poll worker and work for the county boards of elections in November should come back out again and volunteer for this runoff.
Yes.
There, very seldom does one state have an opportunity to elect two senators. Um, this is this is a very important election, and it's actually phase two of the November election when these senators were also on the ballot. So whoever you voted for, we're nonpartisan, but whoever you voted for the Senate in the primary and in the general election, we need you to come back out and vote in the runoff in January. It's going to be very, very important. And the Senate, the Senate, the Senate will be decided by what happens in Georgia in January.
Yeah. It's really an amazing time to be a Georgian.
Mhm.
Um, and another thing that I wanted to ask, kind of in the same vein of that, is what, speaking of the importance, what does this race and already the historic victories that we've been able to achieve, what does that mean for the future of Black Georgians in our state and of Georgians at large?
Yeah. Well, it means that, particularly one of the things that we saw, not only Black Georgians, but certainly Georgians from all walks of life are concerned about racial justice and our criminal legal system. And we saw, African American Georgians take the lead in standing up for the need to change our criminal legal system to make sure that everyone in our society, everyone in our community feels safe, that
Mhm.
public safety is for everybody, that some people that particularly African American members of the community don't have to be afraid of the police, that they're not racially profiled, that they're not treated differently from other people in our community. And so we saw this become a real priority issue for
Mhm.
people across the state of Georgia, from Glenn County, where Ahmaud Arbery was from, to Atlanta, where Rayshard Brooks was killed. And, this issue is so important. And this is one of the issues that there's a lot we can do at the state level, but, a lot of these things also happen at the federal level. Right now, the federal government is in the way of doing some of the changes, say, for example, for marijuana, the things that we want to do to decriminalize drugs, the war on drugs, we know has had a horrible effect on the Black community. Many people say worse than the drugs themselves. Um, it's just one area where the who is in the Senate will make a difference in terms of whether or not we can make the changes that the people have clearly said they want to see on this issue of criminal legal system reform.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And then I wanted to pivot because we recently, and very recently, as of today, got the news that there will be a recount here in Georgia. And I was just curious to ask you,
Yeah,
what force or forces do you think are driving that recount, and
yeah.
what do you think about the
Yeah.
recounts? Mhm.
Well, I think it's a waste of resources and time and energy. The staff of the boards of elections and the folks who volunteer to do these elections are exhausted. They have been working around the clock to get this vote. Uh, Interestingly, the law around does allow for the Secretary of State to order a recount, but the law requires that there is some allegation of mistakes or errors in the count. And so there have not been any, there's been no specific allegation of, well, what are you saying was done wrong in the count, except that you don't like the result. It's a little bit like, playing kickball with somebody, and every time you score a point, they say you're cheating. um, there's no rule that's been cited. There's no process. There's no specific. So it's not that they have made allegations that they can't prove. They've
Mhm.
not even made allegations, and so of any specificity, and so you can't even disprove them because they won't even say what they think you did wrong. um, and yet there's going to be these tremendous resources put into a recount. Our mantra has been count every vote.
Mhm.
As long as the counting is fair, as long as the recount is fair and they're not trying to intimidate people and make them do things that are against the law, or improper procedure, which is something I do have a concern about.
Okay.
But we have no fear of a legitimate recount that counts every vote and counts all the legitimate ballots that were submitted by Georgia citizens during this election. But I do think it shows very poor sportsmanship. Our
Mhm.
parents, even after, when people lose a football game in Georgia, even in high school, you have to go shake
That's
the
right.
hand of the other team. And you see that ritual where everybody lines up and goes and shakes the hand and says, good game, thanks for playing, hey, congratulations. And that's our culture in Georgia. So I don't really understand this culture where when you lose, you say that somebody was cheating. I think it's shameful. Uh, I think it's an insult to many of the volunteers in 159 counties. that take their job very seriously, and that still, if anything, I think the most likely result, if it's a fair count, the most likely result is that they'll find more votes that they don't like, not fewer.
Right. And I will say though that faith in this entire process is beneficial to us all. Like you said, this isn't a
Yes.
partisan thing.
Yeah.
It's the fact that democracy needs to work
Yeah.
for everyone. So
Yeah, and I want to say, about Secretary Raffensperger. I mean, I refer to him as sort of an Atticus Finch figure. I think that he is a decent man, a technocrat. Who said there's a pandemic,
hmm
and I'm gonna, I think it's only fair that we make it possible for people to vote without risking their lives. And so I think that he has performed in a way that has been collaborative, uh, that's created probably the most fair process that we've seen in some time. As the ACLU, of course, there are things that we would do differently, things that we would advocate to change, like same day registration, for example. But I think, given the rules that currently exist, Secretary Raffensperger, has applied those rules in a fair and even-handed manner.
okay. And you mentioned resources in regards to the recount earlier, but I wanted to ask, um, do you think that there are the appropriate resources available to efficiently facilitate a fair and safe runoff election? And are there any ways that our supporters and listeners can get involved with us to further ensure that?
Well, I think that our listeners need to make sure that everyone in their circle knows that there is a runoff election on
Mhm.
January the 5th, that absentee ballots will be available for that. If you voted absentee in November, go ahead and request that absentee ballot again. I think the online portal is still available, um, and early voting will be available for that. I think it's December 14th. Excuse me. It'll be December 14th. Early voting will start for the runoff. So, get it done, get it over with so you can enjoy your holidays. But by all means, the best present you could give yourself for 2021 is a vote in the primary for these two Senate elections on January 5th, which will
That's a
be
good question.
so. As we say now, January 5th is your last day to vote. But you can begin that process now by requesting your absentee ballot.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. Andrea, it is always a treat having you on to our peachy little show. Um, Thank you for your continued leadership as a staff member, but then just the guiding force that drives the conversation here on this platform. So thanks again.
Right. Well, thank you, Kenyatta, for hosting this podcast and keeping the voice of the ACLU of Georgia going out into the world.
That's right. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, friends, that takes care of another episode. Thank you so much for listening. To check out all of the work we do here at the ACLU of Georgia and to find all of our voting and elections resources, visit acluga.org. And be sure to follow us across social media at ACLU of GA. Finally, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. I'm your host, Kenyatta Kinlach, reminding you to listen like your rights depend on it. Until next time.